When the world fell apart, Caleb Foster never thought he'd lose everything in a single day. The morning had started like any other, chaotic, messy, rushed. His alarm clock had died sometime in the middle of the night, so he woke up to the blaring honk of a passing truck outside his dingy apartment window. His back ached from another restless night on the sagging couch, and a dull headache pulsed behind his eyes. The place was a wreck. Dishes piled in the sink, unopened mail scattered across the counter, Sophie's toys strewn across the floor. His daughter's laughter had once filled these walls. Now the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator, struggling to keep up. Caleb grabbed the nearest shirt from the floor, shook it out, and threw it on. It smelled stale, but there was no time for laundry, let alone ironing. His only clean pair of pants was stiff from yesterday's sweat. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair, swallowed a mouthful of lukewarm coffee, and bolted out the door. He was already late. By the time he pulled into the factory's parking lot, his hands were clenched tight around the steering wheel. He rushed inside, his heart pounding in his chest, but the moment he stepped into the break room, he knew something was wrong. The usual chatter had died down. A few of his coworkers, men he had worked alongside for years, avoided his gaze. They shifted awkwardly, their coffee cups held too tightly. Then he saw his manager. Doyle stood by the supervisor's office, arms crossed, expression grim. Caleb didn't need to hear the words to know what was coming. "Caleb," Doyle said, nodding toward the office. Caleb's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to walk forward. The office smelled like stale coffee and old paperwork. His heart pounded as he sat down across from Doyle, his gaze immediately locking onto the stack of HR paperwork sitting on the desk. "This can't be happening," Caleb muttered. Doyle exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Look, I fought for you. I really did. But the company's making cuts, and with your attendance record." "I have a daughter," Caleb blurted out. Things have been." "I know," Doyle said, voice flat but not unkind. "But my hands are tied." Caleb swallowed hard. "Give me one more chance. I'll come in early. It's done." Doyle slid the termination papers across the desk. "You're officially off the books by the end of the day." For a long moment, Caleb just stared at the papers. He wanted to fight, to demand, to plead. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't change a damn thing. He was out of a job. No job meant no paycheck. No paycheck meant no rent. And no rent meant no home. Caleb barely remembered walking out of the office. The world had become a blur. The factory felt foreign now, like a place he no longer belonged. He barely felt the cold air as he stepped outside and fumbled for his phone. A voicemail notification blinked on the screen. He pressed play with trembling fingers. His landlord's voice came through, firm and unapologetic. "Your grace period is up. I've already changed the locks. If your stuff's still inside, you'll need to come by the office and settle your balance first." The message ended. Caleb's pulse roared in his ears. No, this wasn't happening. He shoved his phone into his pocket and drove home like a madman, his fingers clenched so tightly around the steering wheel they ached. By the time he pulled up to the curb outside his apartment complex, his stomach twisted into knots. His belongings were on the sidewalk. Clothes, boxes, Sophie's toys. His daughter's entire world scattered like garbage. A gust of wind sent one of her drawings skidding across the pavement. Caleb lunged for it before it disappeared into the street. The crayon colors were smudged, but he could still make out her name. The hearts she had drawn around the stick figures of them together. His jaw clenched. He shoved the drawing into his pocket, swallowing the bile rising in his throat. He had no time to fall apart. With shaking hands, he started gathering his things, throwing them haphazardly into the back seat of his car. A winter coat, a bag of canned food, a framed photo of him and Sophie at the zoo, now cracked. His phone rang again. He hesitated. His ex-wife never called unless she had something to say. And if she was calling now? He answered, "Steph, I filed for full custody." Caleb froze. The words hit like a physical blow. His grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles turning white. "You can't do this," he choked out. "I already did." The call ended. Caleb stood there, the weight of the world crashing down on him. He had lost his job, his home, and now he was about to lose Sophie. The next morning, Caleb stood in a courtroom, wearing the only blazer he owned, a borrowed tie too tight around his throat. He barely heard the legal jargon spilling from Stephanie's lawyer. Every word was a hammer strike, each argument another nail in the coffin. Unstable home environment, repeated financial struggles, failure to maintain steady employment. They weren't lying, but they weren't telling the whole truth either. Caleb wanted to speak, to explain, to tell the judge that he loved Sophie more than anything in the world. But what could he say? No job, no home, nothing to offer but his word. Stephanie sat across from him, expression unreadable. Beside her, Even was the picture of calm, crisp suit, relaxed posture, the very image of a stable, reliable stepmother. The judge's voice rang out like a death sentence. Custody granted to Stephanie and Even Vaughn. Supervised visitation only. A gavel slammed down. Caleb felt like he had been punched in the gut. Across the room, Sophie burst into tears. "Daddy, no." She tried to run to him, but the bailiff held her back. Her tiny hands clawed at his sleeve, her face twisted in panic. "Please, don't let them take me." The courtroom blurred. The sound of the gavel might as well have been a coffin lid slamming shut. Sophie was gone. Caleb didn't know how long he sat on the courthouse steps, his fingers clenched around the one thing he had left of Sophie, her teddy bear. It was small, its fur worn from years of being carried around. A few feet away, Stephanie and Even walked out together. Even's hand rested on Sophie's shoulder, guiding her toward their car. She looked back. Tears streamed down her face. Caleb wanted to run to her, to grab her, to hold her, to tell her he wasn't giving up. Instead, he gritted his teeth and stood. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. No matter how long it took, he would get her back. The fight for redemption. Caleb Foster had hit rock bottom. He stood outside the courthouse, the winter wind biting through his thin jacket, his hands clenched so tightly around Sophie's worn-out teddy bear that his knuckles turned white. His daughter had been ripped away from him, and the system had declared him unfit. But the system was wrong. He wasn't perfect. He had made mistakes. But one thing was certain, he was not going to let Even Vaughn raise his daughter. Even. The smug bastard who had stood in that courtroom with his clean-cut appearance and his calculated smiles. The man who had wrapped his fingers around Stephanie's mind like a snake. The man who had dared to put his hand on Sophie's shoulder, as if she was his own child. Caleb gritted his teeth, shoving the teddy bear into his pocket. He had no job, no home, no money. But he had a purpose. Get Sophie back, no matter what. Sleeping in shadows. That night, Caleb sat behind an abandoned gas station, leaning against the cold steel of a dumpster. His car, now his home, was parked nearby, its back seat stuffed with the last remnants of his old life. The hunger clawed at his stomach, but he ignored it. The exhaustion pulled at his body, but he forced himself to stay awake. He needed a plan. His first step was survival. Without a job, he wouldn't get an apartment. Without an apartment, he wouldn't be able to prove to the courts that he could provide stability. He had to start somewhere. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, he would hit the pavement and find work. Any work. No matter how brutal, no matter how demeaning, he would not stop. A knock on his car window startled him. Caleb tensed, his body instinctively preparing for a fight. But when he turned, his breath hitched. Marcus. It had been years since he had seen his old friend. "You look like hell," Marcus said, leaning against the car. Caleb let out a humorless laugh. Because I feel like hell. Marcus studied him for a moment. Then, without another word, he jerked his head down the street. Come on, he said. Soup kitchen's open for another hour. Caleb's pride screamed at him to say no. But pride wouldn't get Suffy back. So he followed, a hand extended. The soup kitchen smelled like old bread and something overcooked. Caleb hesitated at the entrance, but Marcus nudged him forward. People filled the tables, men and women who had fallen through the cracks. People who had lost everything, just like him. Caleb grabbed a tray and slid into the line. The woman serving food, an older lady with sharp eyes, scooped a ladle of stew onto his plate without a word. As they sat in the back corner, Caleb pushed the food around his plate, his appetite non-existent. Marcus watched him. You need work. Caleb exhaled sharply. You know anyone hiring? Marcus smirked. Maybe. Caleb looked up. What kind of work? The kind that pays cash. Under the table. A long silence stretched between them. I need something stable, Caleb said finally. Marcus leaned back. You don't get to be picky when you're homeless, man. Caleb clenched his fists. He hated the truth in those words. Marcus tapped the table. You want Suffy back, right? Caleb stiffened. Then you start anywhere you can. And just like that, Caleb had his first real lead. Blood, sweat, and survival. The next morning, Caleb found himself standing outside a small, greasy diner tucked between a pawn shop and a laundromat. A flickering neon sign read, "Help," he wanted. He hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. The smell of burnt coffee and bacon grease clung to the air. The floor was sticky, and a waitress rushed past, balancing a tray of plates. Behind the counter, a woman with cropped gray hair barely glanced up. We're closed, she muttered. I'm not here to eat, Caleb said. I saw the sign. Now she looked up. Her sharp gaze flicked over him, assessing. You got experience. No. You got a record. Caleb hesitated. Nothing that keeps me from working. The woman snorted. That's a hell of a way to answer. Caleb clenched his fists. I just need a chance. A long pause. Then, fine. Caleb blinked. Just like that. She shrugged. You are honest, and you're desperate. That means you'll show up. And just like that, Caleb had a job. Meanwhile, in the Vaughn house, Sophie sat stiffly at the dinner table, staring at her untouched plate. Across from her, Even sipped his wine, his smile never faltering. How was school today? He asked. Sophie didn't answer. Even sighed. Sophie, sweetheart, you know I don't like when you ignore me. Sophie clenched her fork. Her mother sat beside her, tense. Stephanie had been distant lately, softer, but still, she did nothing. Sophie swallowed hard. Can I call my dad? Even's smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened. Sweetheart, he said smoothly, your father isn't calling. Maybe it's time to stop waiting. Sophie's stomach twisted. It wasn't true. It couldn't be true. She needed to talk to him, to ask him, to know he hadn't given up. That night, she snuck into her room and pulled out a notebook. She wrote carefully, trying not to smudge the ink. Dear Daddy, I miss you. I don't believe what they say. I know you didn't leave me. Please don't give up. She folded the letter carefully and hid it under her pillow. Tomorrow, she would find a way to send it. She just had to figure out how. A father's first step. Back at the diner, Caleb worked his first shift. It was brutal, hot, exhausting. By the time the last customer trickled out, his feet ached and his arms felt like lead. Grace, his new boss, leaned against the counter. You coming back tomorrow? Caleb wiped sweat from his brow. If you'll have me. She smirked. We'll see. Caleb exhaled, rubbing his hands together. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One step closer to proving himself. One step closer to getting Sophie back. and he would take every damn step necessary to make sure she was never taken from him again. This fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. A father's war begins. Caleb Foster had never known true exhaustion until now. His body ached. His hands, once strong and steady, were now rough and blistered. The weight of his new reality sat heavy on his shoulders as he scrubbed the greasy diner grill, the scent of burnt toast and old coffee clinging to his clothes. It had been 2 weeks since Grace, the no-nonsense diner owner, had given him a shot. 2 weeks of 14-hour shifts, running on cheap coffee and determination. He had lost his home, his job, and worst of all, his daughter. But he was done being the victim. Every extra shift meant more money saved. Every dollar brought him one step closer to getting Sophie back. He worked himself to the bone, pushing through exhaustion, ignoring the hunger gnawing at his stomach. Because in his mind, he wasn't flipping burgers. He was fighting for Sophie. And he wasn't going to lose. A letter that changed everything. Meanwhile, across town, Sophie sat at her desk in her school classroom, staring at the crumpled letter hidden inside her backpack. Dear Daddy, I miss you. I don't believe what they say. I know you didn't leave me. Please don't give up. Her fingers trembled. She had been carrying the letter for days, waiting for the right moment to send it, but even watched everything. He had taken her phone, erased her dad's number, gotten rid of every trace of Caleb from her life. He wanted her to forget, but she wouldn't. Sophie swallowed hard, glancing toward the front of the classroom. Mrs. Delgado was helping another student, her back turned. Now, this was her chance. She slipped the letter into the bottom of her desk, where only Mrs. Delgado would find it. A single thought ran through her mind as she did it. Please, let this reach him. Worn hands, unbroken spirit. That night, Caleb collapsed onto his mattress, the same thin, second-hand mattress he had dragged into his tiny one-room apartment. It wasn't much. The walls were bare, the floor was cracked, and the heat barely worked. But it was his own place, his first real step toward proving to the courts that he could provide for Sophie. Caleb reached into his pocket, pulling out the last $40 from his tips. He stared at it, feeling the weight of what it represented. 2 weeks ago, he had nothing. Now he had a roof over his head, a steady job, and money saved. It still wasn't enough, but it was a start. As he leaned back against the wall, his phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Got something for you. Meet me behind the diner after your shift. Caleb frowned, but his gut told him to trust Marcus. Marcus had been the only one to help him when he had nothing. And right now, Caleb needed all the help he could get. A dangerous opportunity. The next night, after his shift, Caleb met Marcus behind the diner. The alley smelled like cigarettes and old grease. Marcus leaned against the brick wall, arms crossed. You trust me, right? Marcus asked. Caleb narrowed his eyes. Depends. Marcus smirked. You need money fast, don't you? Caleb exhaled. Yeah. Marcus pulled a set of keys from his pocket and tossed them to Caleb. There's a warehouse downtown. Cleaning job. Pays in cash. No questions asked. Caleb caught the keys, weighing them in his hand. It sounded shady. Too good to be true. But he needed the money. For Sophie. So he nodded. When do I start? A child's cry for help. The next day at school, Mrs. Delgado found Sophie's letter. She unfolded the crumpled piece of paper, her heart aching as she read the words. I don't believe what they say. Please don't give up. The words of a child desperately clinging to hope. Mrs. Delgado glanced toward Sophie, who sat at her desk, quiet, withdrawn. She had changed over the last few months. The bright, talkative girl was gone, replaced by someone smaller, afraid. Mrs. Delgado knew she couldn't ignore this. She had seen the warning signs before. Sophie wasn't just missing her father. Something was wrong at home. She folded the letter and slipped it into her purse. It was time to take action. The warehouse job. Caleb arrived at the warehouse that night, gripping the keys Marcus had given him. The place was massive, rusted metal walls, dim lighting, and a faint smell of motor oil. A man named Ray met him at the entrance. "You clean, you get paid," Ray said, tossing Caleb a mop. Simple. Caleb nodded and got to work. He scrubbed floors, emptied trash, wiped down machinery, anything that kept his mind busy. He worked until his hands bled. The pay was good, too good. But he didn't ask questions. He couldn't afford to. At the end of the shift, Ray handed him a thick envelope of cash. "Keep your head down, and you'll have steady work," Ray said. Caleb didn't like the way he said it, but he took the money anyway. For Sophie, the truth begins to unravel. Back at the Vaughn house, Sophie sat in her room, staring at the wall. Her drawing of her dad, the one she had hidden under her bed, was gone. She knew what that meant. Even had been in her room. Her chest tightened as she heard his footsteps in the hallway. The door creaked open, and he stood there, watching her. "You're still holding on to hope," Even said, his voice smooth, almost amused. Sophie didn't answer. Even sighed. "Your dad isn't coming for you." Sophie clenched her fists. "I don't believe you." Even chuckled. "That's the problem with you, Sophie. You think fairy tales are real." He stepped closer. "Your dad failed you, and the sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." Sophie's stomach twisted. She had to find a way out, a way back to her real dad. She wouldn't stop fighting, because she knew he was fighting for her too. A father's resolve. At his tiny apartment, Caleb counted the cash from the warehouse job. It was more money than he had seen in months, but something about it felt wrong. He stared at the envelope, his gut churning. Was this what he had become? Was this what Sophie would think of him? His hands clenched. No, he would find another way. He would not let his daughter look at him one day and see a man who took the easy way out. He grabbed his phone and called Marcus. "I can't do this," he said. Marcus sighed. "You sure?" "Yeah. Then you better find another job fast." Caleb exhaled. "I will." Because he had something worth fighting for. The first strike against Even. The next day, Caleb received an unexpected call. "Mrs. Delgado." "Caleb," she said, her voice serious. "We need to talk." Caleb's pulse spiked. "What's wrong?" She hesitated. "I found something." Silence. Then, "I think Sophie is in danger." Caleb's grip on the phone tightened. The war had just begun, and he wasn't going to lose. Not this time. A father's reckoning. Caleb Foster gripped the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "What do you mean Sophie's in danger?" His voice came out hoarse, his throat tightening. Mrs. Delgado hesitated on the other end, then sighed. "She left me a note." Caleb's heart pounded. "A note?" "I think she's scared, Caleb. She wrote that she doesn't believe what she's being told, that she knows you didn't leave her. That means someone is trying to convince her otherwise." Caleb clenched his jaw. "Even. It was always Even." Mrs. Delgado continued, her tone softer now. "I can tell something's wrong. She's withdrawn. She's not the same Sophie I knew months ago. I tried bringing it up with Stephanie, but she brushed it off, said Sophie just needed time to adjust." Caleb forced himself to take a slow breath. "What do I do?" "I've already submitted a report to the court," she said. "It might not be enough to change custody immediately, but it's something. You need to keep fighting. Sophie needs to know you're still here." Caleb exhaled sharply. "I'll never stop." Mrs. Delgado was quiet for a moment before she said, "Good, because I don't think she can take much more of that household." The call ended. Caleb sat there, foam still clenched in his fist, staring at the empty wall of his tiny apartment. For months, he had been clawing his way back from the edge, grinding himself into the ground to prove he was worthy of his daughter. But now, Now, it wasn't just about proving himself. Now, it was about getting Sophie out of that house before it was too late. A child's growing fear. Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the door. She had heard the way Ivan spoke to her mother that morning. At first, his voice had been soft, patient, like always. But then it had turned sharp, cold. Stephanie had barely said a word since. Sophie didn't understand why her mother didn't see it, why she couldn't tell that Ivan was dangerous. She had tried to tell her, tried to explain that Ivan was throwing away her dad's letters, deleting his messages, making her feel like she was trapped in a house that wasn't hers. But every time, Stephanie just smiled sadly and said, "Sweetheart, you have to give him a chance." Sophie didn't want to give him a chance. She wanted her dad. Her hands clenched into fists. She couldn't wait anymore. She had to find a way back to him. A dangerous gamble. Caleb didn't sleep that night. Instead, he spent hours researching everything he could about custody battles, about how to prove that Sophie was in an unsafe environment. He had the job. He had the apartment. He had character statements from people who believed in him. But it still wasn't enough. The courts wanted evidence, and he had to find a way to get it. An unexpected call. 3 days later, Caleb's phone buzzed again. A number he didn't recognize. He answered hesitantly. "Hello." A small voice. "Daddy?" Caleb nearly dropped the phone. His breath hitched. "Sophie." A quiet sniffle. "Daddy, I." A muffled noise. A door opening. Then Ivan's voice, smooth and controlled. "Sophie, who are you talking to?" The call ended. Caleb shot to his feet, heart hammering. She had called him, which meant she had found a way past Ivan, and Ivan had caught her. Caleb's fists tightened. This was war, and he was about to hit back. Gathering the pieces, Caleb stormed into the diner that afternoon, his mind spinning. Grace took one look at him and raised an eyebrow. "You look like a man about to make a mistake." Caleb exhaled sharply. "I need your help." Grace crossed her arms. "What kind of help?" Caleb hesitated. "I need a lawyer." Grace studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You're serious about this?" "I don't have a choice." She nodded slowly. "I know someone. He's not cheap, but he's damn good." Caleb swallowed hard. "I'll figure out the money." Because there was no price too high for getting his daughter back. Ivan's control tightens. That night, Ivan stood in Sophie's doorway, his arms crossed. "You called him." Sophie's stomach twisted. I just wanted to." Ivan sighed, stepping closer. "You need to understand something, Sophie," he said, his voice calm, measured. "Your father lost. He failed you. And the sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." Sophie's eyes burned. She hated him. She hated the way he lied. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that her dad would never stop fighting for her. But she didn't, because she knew that if she pushed too hard, Ivan would take away what little freedom she had left. So instead, she lowered her gaze and whispered, "I'm sorry." Ivan smiled. "Good girl." Then he reached out and ruffled her hair like she was a pet. Sophie clenched her teeth. She would never stop fighting. The war begins. The next morning, Caleb met the lawyer Grace had recommended, a sharp-dressed man with silver hair and piercing eyes. "You have a hell of a case ahead of you," the lawyer said, flipping through the paperwork Caleb had gathered. "Ivan has money, influence. He's played this game before." Caleb gritted his teeth. "I don't care." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "Good, because if you want to win this, you're going to need more than just a job and an apartment." He leaned forward. "You're going to need to expose him." Caleb inhaled sharply. "How?" The lawyer smirked. "You're not going to like it." A desperate move. Later that night, as Caleb sat in his apartment, staring at the worn-out teddy bear that used to belong to Sophie, his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. He picked up, his chest tightening. "Daddy?" "Sophie." Caleb's throat closed. "Baby, are you okay?" Her voice shook. "No." A pause. Then, "Daddy, I want to come home." Caleb clenched his fists. "I'm going to make that happen, sweetheart," he whispered. "I promise." And this time, he wouldn't lose. The breaking point. Caleb's breath caught in his throat as Sophie's small, trembling voice filled his ear. "Daddy, I want to come home." The weight of those words crushed him. He swallowed, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Sophie, sweetheart, I need you to listen to me. Are you safe?" A pause. Then a shaky, whispered, "I don't know." Caleb's grip on the phone tightened. "I should be there. I should be the one protecting her." "Sophie," he said, his voice low but firm, "I need you to be strong, okay? I promise I'm going to get you back. But I need you to be careful, okay?" Her voice was so small. "Does your mom know you're calling me?" A pause. "No, even." "Took my phone. I used Mom's while she was in the shower." Caleb's stomach churned. The bastard was isolating her. "Sophie, listen to me." Footsteps. Then, the sound of a door opening. "Sophie." Even. The line cut dead. Caleb stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. His chest tightened with helpless rage. That was it. Enough. He grabbed his keys and stormed out of his apartment. This war had just turned personal. A father's desperation. The drive across town was a blur. Caleb's mind raced with every worst-case scenario. He wanted to storm into that house, rip Sophie away, and never look back. But he couldn't. If he broke the law, he'd lose her forever. Think, Caleb. Think. He forced himself to slow his breathing as he pulled up outside the Vaughn house. The neighborhood was as pristine as ever, white picket fences, well-manicured lawns. But to him, the house in front of him was nothing but a cage holding his daughter hostage. He stared at the front door. He had no right to be here, but he didn't care. He climbed out of his car and crossed the driveway, his fists clenched. He rang the doorbell, heart pounding. A moment later, the door swung open. Stephanie stood there, blinking in surprise. "Caleb." He didn't waste time. "I need to see Sophie." Stephanie hesitated. "Caleb, you know that's not." "I know she called me." He cut in. "I know even took her phone. I know she's not okay. So don't stand there and pretend like everything is fine." Stephanie's expression faltered. For the first time, Caleb saw something new in her eyes. Doubt. Fear. "Caleb." She swallowed. "This isn't the time." He stepped closer. "Steph, I'm begging you. Let me see my daughter." Before she could respond, a smooth, calculated voice interrupted. "That's not happening." Caleb turned. Even stood in the doorway now, his arms crossed, his expression calm. But his eyes were filled with warning. Caleb clenched his fists so tightly his nails dug into his palms. "Stay the hell away from my daughter," he growled. Even smirked. "Your daughter." He shook his head. "Sophie belongs here, Caleb. With a stable home. A good family. She is my family. You lost that privilege." Caleb's vision blurred with fury. "You don't give a damn about Sophie." Even smirk widened. "The courts disagree." Caleb took a step forward, but Stephanie quickly placed a hand on his chest. "Stop," she whispered. He looked at her, searching her face. She was scared. But was she scared of him? Or even? "Please, just go," she whispered. "You'll make things worse." Caleb's chest rose and fell rapidly. This wasn't over. He turned without another word and stormed back to his car. As he climbed inside and gripped the steering wheel, he looked up at the house. And that's when he saw it. Upstairs, in the window, Sophie. Her tiny hands pressed against the glass, her face pale, eyes pleading. Caleb's heart cracked wide open. "I'm going to save you, baby girl." no matter what it took. Turning the tide. That night, Caleb met with his lawyer. "I want to file for an emergency custody hearing," he said. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, eyeing Caleb carefully. "That's a long shot. The courts don't reverse decisions easily." Caleb slammed a folder onto the desk. "I have evidence." The lawyer raised an eyebrow and flipped it open. Inside were Mrs. Delgado's written report about Sophie's withdrawn behavior, a record of Sophie's sudden drop in school performance, a photo of a bruise on Sophie's wrist. Caleb's jaw tightened as he pointed at the last one. "She had that the last time I saw her," he said. "She wouldn't tell me what happened, but I know." The lawyer was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed. "This changes things." Caleb exhaled sharply. "So we fight." The lawyer nodded. "We fight." A mother's realization. Stephanie paced the kitchen, rubbing her temples. Her stomach was in knots. She had seen the way Even spoke to Caleb at the door. The control, the arrogance. And then she had seen Sophie at the window. She knew, deep down, that something was wrong. But if she admitted that, if she really admitted it, then she had to admit that she had failed as a mother. Her hands shook. She had believed Evan when he told her that Caleb was unfit. She had believed him when he said he was only trying to give Sophie stability. But now she wasn't so sure. She turned, her gaze landing on Sophie's backpack sitting by the door. A small folded piece of paper was sticking out of the pocket. Frowning, she pulled it out. It was a drawing. Sophie and Caleb, standing together, holding hands. Her throat tightened. She flipped it over. In the corner, written in shaky handwriting, "I just want to go home." Stephanie's hands trembled. The first victory. The day of the emergency hearing arrived faster than Caleb had expected. He stood in the courthouse, his pulse roaring in his ears. Stephanie sat across from him, looking pale and unsure. Even sat beside her, his usual smugness in place. But there was something different this time. Stephanie wouldn't look at him. The judge entered. The room settled. Then the case began. Caleb's lawyer laid everything out. Sophie's emotional distress, the controlling environment, the photo of the bruise. Evan's lawyer tried to dismiss it, said it was circumstantial. But then Stephanie stood up. "I want to speak," she said. Silence. Even looked stunned. Stephanie swallowed hard and looked directly at the judge. I think I made a mistake." The words slammed into Caleb's chest. "I believed Even when he said Caleb wasn't fit to be in Sophie's life," she continued, her voice shaking. "But I was wrong." She turned her head, looking at Even. "And I think I've been wrong about a lot of things." A pause. Then the judge nodded. "Temporary custody will be reviewed," she said. "For now, visitation will be increased immediately." Caleb exhaled sharply, his body shaking. It wasn't over, but it was a win. And Sophie was one step closer to coming home. The reckoning. Caleb Foster sat in the dimly lit courtroom, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The moment Stephanie had spoken, the moment she had stood up against Even in front of the judge, he had felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself in months. Hope. The words still rang in his ears. "I think I made a mistake." For months, Stephanie had been blind to the truth, blind to the control Even had wrapped around her like chains. But something had changed. Something had broken. The judge had ruled in his favor. It wasn't full custody. Not yet. But it was a step. Visitation increased, supervised no longer. And the court would reevaluate the situation in a few weeks. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But Caleb wasn't leaving this fight unfinished. He stood outside the courthouse, the cold air biting at his skin. Stephanie lingered a few feet away, arms crossed, avoiding his gaze. She looked exhausted. "Steph." She tensed but finally looked at him. "I know you love her," Caleb said quietly. "I know you thought you were doing what was best for her. But we both know she's not safe in that house. Stephanie inhaled sharply. I don't know. Yes, you do. His voice was steady, unwavering. I saw it in your face back there. You know. Stephanie swallowed hard, wrapping her arms around herself. I don't know what to do, Caleb. His chest tightened. I do, he said. Stephanie's gaze lifted, searching his face. For the first time in years, she truly looked at him. A daughter's fading light. Sophie sat on her bed, staring at the door, waiting. She could hear Even downstairs, talking in low tones. Her mother wasn't answering. Something was different. Something was coming. She curled up, clutching her worn-out teddy bear, the last thing she had of her father. He was fighting for her. She knew it, but she was scared. Scared that Even would find another way to keep them apart. Scared that the courts wouldn't believe her. Scared that maybe, just maybe, Even was right. Maybe her dad had already lost. Tears burned her eyes. But just as she was about to break, she heard it. A car, pulling into the driveway. Her heart leaped into her throat. Daddy. Even's control shatters. The knock on the door was sharp, firm. Even glanced at Stephanie, irritation flickering across his face. Stay here. Stephanie hesitated but nodded. She was afraid of him. She wouldn't say it, wouldn't admit it, but she was. Even opened the door. And there he was, Caleb, standing there, unyielding. Even smirked. Well, look who decided to play hero. Caleb's jaw tightened. I'm here for Sophie. Even leaned against the doorframe, pretending to be amused. But Caleb saw the tension in his shoulders. You lost in court, Foster. You don't get to just show up and demand things. Caleb took a step forward. The judge ruled that I can see her. I'm here for my visitation. Even tilted his head. Not convenient right now. Caleb's fists clenched. You don't get to decide that. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, a small voice broke through the tension. Daddy, Sophie, standing at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide, hopeful. Even's face darkened. Caleb didn't hesitate. Sophie, come here. She ran. Down the stairs, past Even, and into Caleb's arms. The moment he felt her small body against his chest, the fight, the pain, the exhaustion, all of it was worth it. Daddy, she sobbed, clutching him tight. Caleb closed his eyes, holding her like his life depended on it. I got you, baby. Even's voice was tight with controlled anger. She's not leaving this house. Caleb lifted his head, eyes blazing. She is. A long silence stretched between them. Then, Stephanie's voice, quiet but firm. She's going. Even snapped his gaze to her. Excuse me. Stephanie swallowed hard. She looked at Sophie, at the way she was clinging to her father, desperate, afraid. And she knew. This wasn't love. This was control. And she had let it happen. Tears burned her eyes as she finally said the words she should have said months ago. I want a divorce. Even's face twisted with fury. But it was too late. His power was slipping. And Caleb had won. A new beginning. The ride back to Caleb's apartment was quiet. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, hugging her teddy bear close. She still looked afraid. As if this was all temporary. As if Even would somehow take her back. Caleb reached over, squeezing her small hand in his. You're safe now, he said softly. She looked up at him, eyes glistening. Really? She whispered. He smiled. Really? Sophie exhaled, her tiny fingers tightening around his. For the first time, in a long, long time, she believed him. And so did he. Because this wasn't just a battle won. This was the start of a brand new life. One where Sophie would never doubt that she was loved. One where she would never be taken from him again. And as Caleb drove toward home, he knew. This was just the beginning. A father's promise. Caleb Foster had spent months clawing his way back from rock bottom. But now, as he drove through the quiet streets with Sophie beside him, his grip firm on the steering wheel, his heart pounded with something new. Relief, terror, hope. She was free. He had won. But now came the hardest part. Proving to her that she was safe. Proving to her that she would never have to live in fear again. That this wasn't temporary. That she was finally home. The first night home. Sophie sat on Caleb's couch, hugging her knees to her chest. She looked so small. Caleb busied himself in the kitchen, trying to give her space, but every time he glanced over, she was staring at nothing. The weight of what she had been through hung heavy in the air. He placed a plate of mac and cheese in front of her. "Figured you'd be hungry," he said gently. Sophie didn't move. Caleb swallowed hard, then lowered himself onto the couch beside her. She finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think I'd ever get out." Caleb's jaw clenched. He had spent so many sleepless nights picturing the hell she must have been living in. But hearing her say it, it ripped him apart. He exhaled, forcing his voice to stay steady. "You don't have to worry about that anymore, sweetheart." She hesitated. What if he tries to take me back?" Caleb looked her in the eye. "He won't." She searched his face, as if testing the truth of his words. "I promise," he added. Sophie's lip trembled. Then, to his shock, she launched herself into his arms. Caleb's breath caught as he held her, feeling her tiny body shake against him. "I missed you, Daddy." Tears burned his eyes. "I missed you more, baby girl." And he meant it. Building trust again. The next few days were different. Sophie was quiet. She didn't talk much, didn't laugh like she used to. Caleb noticed the way she flinched at sudden noises, the way she hesitated before answering simple questions, as if waiting for the wrong response to get her in trouble. Even had done a number on her, and it made Caleb's blood boil. But anger wouldn't fix this. Only time would. So he was patient. He let her sleep in as long as she wanted. He made her favorite meals, even when she barely touched them. He let her sit in silence, never pushing her to talk, just letting her be. And little by little, something changed. One morning, he walked into the kitchen to find Sophie standing on a chair, trying to pour milk into her cereal. Caleb froze. It was such a small thing. But in the Vaughn house, Avon had controlled everything. What she ate, what she wore, when she spoke. And now, she was making her own bowl of cereal. It was the first time she had made a choice just for herself. Caleb swallowed hard and forced a smile. "You trying to put me out of a job, kid?" Sophie turned, startled. Then, for the first time, she smiled. It was small, barely there. But it was real. And in that moment, Caleb knew. She was healing. The final fight. But Avon wasn't done. 2 weeks after Sophie moved in, Caleb received an emergency court summons. Avon was contesting custody. Caleb stood outside the courthouse, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. Grace and Marcus stood beside him. "You ready for this?" Marcus asked. Caleb exhaled. "I don't have a choice." Inside, the courtroom was cold. The judge's expression was unreadable as she studied both sides. Avon's lawyer stood first. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe Mr. Foster is unfit to provide long-term stability for Sophie Vaughn." Caleb forced himself to stay still. He was expecting this. The lawyer continued, listing every mistake Caleb had ever made. His job losses, his eviction, his struggles. Simply put, the lawyer said smoothly, this man is not capable of providing a life of comfort for a child. Silence. Then it was Caleb's turn. His lawyer stood, adjusting his glasses. "With all due respect, Your Honor, my client is not the same man he was a year ago." Then the evidence came out. Employment records, proof of stable housing, character statements from Grace, Marcus, and Mrs. Delgado. Then, Stephanie took the stand, even stiffened. Stephanie's voice shook, but she spoke. I was wrong, she admitted. I thought Caleb wasn't capable, but I was blind to what was really happening in my home. She turned to the judge, her voice stronger now. Sophie belongs with her father. The judge studied both sides for what felt like an eternity. Then, finally, her gavel struck. Full custody is granted to Caleb Foster. The words slammed into Caleb's chest. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Then, he turned to Sophie. Tears streamed down her face. She lunged into his arms, and Caleb held her tightly. This time, he would never let go. A new chapter. The following weeks were different. Sophie smiled more. She laughed. She played. For the first time in a long time, she was a child again. One night, as Caleb tucked her into bed, she hesitated. Then she whispered, "Daddy?" He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Yeah, baby." She looked up at him, eyes filled with something he hadn't seen in forever. "Peace. I love you." Caleb's breath hitched. "I love you too, sweetheart." And as he turned off the light, knowing that she was finally safe, he whispered one last promise. "You're home now, and you always will be."